We're still locked in this COVID-19 pandemic, but now we've arrived at the summer holiday season. And many of us are itching to travel somewhere afar, away from this lockdown and this new normal of social distancing and restricted freedoms. The situation is, however, not getting much better, and in fact it's getting worse as infections continue to spike in second, even third waves for some countries. This is not only frustrating for those of us who want to go on holiday, but it's detrimental to the more than 75 million people working in the tourism industry around the world. So the question on everyone's lips is when travel will come back, and will it be the same again? For this, we have joining us today Dr. Richard Butler, Emeritus Professor of Tourism at Strathclyde University. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Right. Well, you're in Canada, I believe, at Prince Rupert. How's everything there?
It's cloudy, not very summery, quite cool. Feel like travelling away from it.
Right, lovely to have you joining us. And well, we also have Dr. Ian Lee, Associate Professor at Carleton University Sprott School of Business. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Good evening. Good evening. My pleasure to be able to join you.
Right, well, I know that you're a bit of a frequent flyer yourself, so this lockdown must be very frustrating for you.
This is the first time in 32 years that I have not crossed the ocean to Europe because I've been teaching. I have family in England because of my late father, and I have not been on a plane since the COVID crisis occurred, and it is just such a strange and bizarre feeling because I'm on a plane, every 2 or 3 weeks, and it's just I'm in isolation and lockdown. It's just bizarre.
Well, Dr. Butler, it seems like you can't go back to Scotland yourself either in the next, for the next few months, it seems like. But, well, Dr. Butler, let's start with you first. There are many restrictions, as we're all experiencing, on travelling to other countries, either for leisure or for work, due to mandatory self-quarantines and even entry bans. How long do you see this continuing?
As long as COVID's around, unfortunately. I don't see it ending shortly. I think a lot of places will ease restrictions, as we're already seeing with attendant problems in Florida and elsewhere in the US. And I think we'll run into the problem of second and third waves. And I'll be very surprised if there are no restrictions in a year's time. I think places will still be hanging on. Some of the South Pacific islands, New Zealand, for example, will be very reluctant to open up when it's pretty well eliminated COVID and run the risk of having foreigners introduce it. So it's going to be, I think, probably a long time before all the restrictions are gone, and it will vary enormously, I think, from place to place and from month to month.
Wow, so you're predicting up to a year until, lockdowns are eased. Well, Dr. Lee, I know you're itching to travel somewhere as well and get on that plane, but the same question goes to you. How long do you see this lockdown lasting?
Well, I do agree with Dr. Butler. I mean, there's two separate problems. One is the issue of governments. I mean, the borders are closed in some countries, Canada being Exhibit A. We've completely closed down the border to the world, by and large. I mean, there's a few exceptions. But then the second problem is, even if they do open up the border, how many people are going to get on that plane and fly if they believe that there's a pretty decent risk of contacting COVID? So there's the two separate issues. There's the government responding to the public health threat, and then there's the consumer psychology of people who are going to be terrified to be getting on that plane and flying for several hours, not knowing if there's anyone else on that plane that has COVID. So there's two separate issues there, and it's clearly going to depend on things like a vaccine or some kind of very fast testing that can be done on the spot at every airport around the world.
Right, and even with the option to travel, I feel a lot of nervousness around, travelling, getting on a plane. Is anyone near me infected? Am I infected? So, Dr. Lee, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about travel bubbles recently. Do you think such arrangements can be made? And what do you think should be the basic requirements of travelling across borders?
We're seeing them in Europe. I wish Canada would have one with some of the countries of Europe. That is to say, countries that have very low rates of infection, where the mortality rate has declined very dramatically, as we're seeing in most of the countries in Europe and the European Union, as we're seeing in Canada, in sharp contrast to the United States. So it can be done, I think, with all of the caveats of social distancing and testing and so forth. But I do think it's workable between two countries that are low risk, meaning that they seem to have it under control. They've adopted public policy measures to ensure that it's not going to spread. And again, I'm using in contrast to the United States, where they're clearly, it's not under control at all.
And Dr. Butler, what's your view on this? Do you think travel bubbles, they can grow? Do you think they're sustainable? Do you think they can work?
I'd like them to work because I want to go and visit my daughter in New Zealand after Christmas. And I'm not very optimistic about that at the moment. I think there are the two problems. The one is perception. Do people believe it's safe to travel? Do they believe the restrictions will be upheld and everything else? And then the other one is the politics and the actual government policies and restrictions that are in place. I'd like to believe travel bubbles could work. I think within Europe, at least within mainland Europe, maybe excluding Britain because Britain's in a bit of a dodgy situation, they may well work. But the real problem is whether people will be honest and play fair, or whether they will try and get around them. And I think myself, there are too many ways that people can get around the travel bubble of coming into one country, driving to the next one and flying out of there. So I'd like to believe travel bubbles could come in. I think there'll be attempts to get them in. And then it'll depend how people believe, what people believe and how they behave, whether they will work. They could work. Whether they will, I'm not sure.
Well, it looks like there's going to be a certain extent of trust that needs to be established for them to work. Well, Dr. Lee, do you think there are any creative ways that the travel and hospitality sector can minimise their losses during this time, as they are suffering very horrendously during this pandemic? And do you think they can even perhaps develop new products to ride out this virus?
I'm not so much sure of new products. I've looked at the data on cargo, and the cargo just, I mean, the potential volume of cargo just isn't there in terms of the volume and the dollars of cargo to offset the lost revenues from people flying. It's a very, it's important, it's nice, but it's certainly not going to be the solution to the upwards of 1 billion tourists, according to the World Tourism Organization, that claim are no longer flying. I think, though, they could come up with new markets, if you will. I mean, we're hearing this buzzword, this cliche about a staycation. I'm not so much saying a staycation, but if the country, and I'm obviously thinking of Canada, very large country, 8,000 kilometers in length, if you can't fly people outside of Canada, and that's Air Canada's problem, well, then maybe they should be encouraging people to fly and travel inside Canada. And people in hospitality and tourism should be encouraging people to drive for their vacations, and I'm seeing ads to that effect. So I do think that they can do something, but again, it's not going to replace the complete collapse in revenues that they've experienced.
And which countries do you think, Dr. Butler, will suffer the most from the fallout of this freeze in tourism?
I think the US is going to suffer fairly heavily until it gets its act together and reduces the rate of increase. I think in one sense the US has been a little unfortunate that because it is doing so much active testing, despite all the things Trump says, there is a measure of truth that if you test a lot, you'll pick up a lot of cases. But I think the US is one that's going to suffer fairly heavily. I think China will also suffer, partly politically, partly because of its actions in the last few weeks with Hong Kong and so forth, but also because of the image of the place in which the COVID originated. And so I think China, US, probably India and Brazil are the ones that will suffer most in terms of absolute numbers. In relative terms, it's places like Cook Islands, Fiji, the Caribbean islands that are probably going to suffer, Maldives, on a greater percentage basis because so much of their GDP comes from tourism. In the US, if they lose the tourism budget, it won't affect their GDP very much. It's a catastrophe for some of the small island states that are heavily dependent on tourism.
Exactly, and you've actually been pushing for sustainable tourism over the years, and well, you've actually been hoping that there would be less long-haul travel. We're definitely seeing a lot of less travel now, but many people do feel stuck, especially during the summer holiday. So, Dr. Butler, what do you think are some perhaps alternative options for travel, and what can we do to make travel more sustainable?
Well, as my colleague said, staycations is the buzzword at the moment of holidaying in your own country. You can drive, you can train, you can bus. You don't have to fly. I become very cynical and skeptical about the term sustainable tourism because as long as you're traveling, you're not sustainable. So sustainable tourism to me doesn't exist. I think what we need to do is make tourism more sustainable, but we'll never get there entirely. So yes, shorter trips means less impact. Staying in your own country, your own region for a while will cut down the numbers. We're in a peculiar position with COVID because things which normally get very heavily criticized, like arrangements like Club Mediterranean and other fenced-in, enclosed tourist resorts where the tourists are separate from the locals, in fact may be the best model when COVID is around, that you keep the tourists in an enclave, in a bubble, in the tourist destination and away from locals. So the chance of spreading COVID through the population at large in the destination is minimized. But normally mass tourism is castigated, particularly by academics. The irony is that on a per capita basis, mass tourism is much more sustainable than a single person traveling 5,000 miles to engage in ecotourism. So the short answer is to reduce the impact, to reduce the COVID spread, stay in your own country. But I don't think it's going to last for a very long time.
Well, I suppose I share that opinion with you. And well, Dr. Lee, do you think there'll be a mad rush to travel overseas once the pandemic subsides?
I want to make a distinction between business travel, which of course is what I study as a strategy prof, and consumer travel or non-business travel. I've seen a number of interviews by the CEO, I think it was American Airlines just last week, who said the business travel is not going to come back anytime soon. The Wall Street Journal just did a very nice examination of business travel, and they came to the same conclusion for the same reasons. CEOs and decision makers in big corporations are finding out that Zoom and Teams and these other technologies are very efficient. You can communicate very quickly and, more importantly, really cheaply. You know, every time you put a person on a plane and you fly them there and they're staying at a 4- or 5-star hotel, it's costing thousands of dollars for every trip. Now they can sit in their office and connect with the other person. They don't lose all that downtime. So I think we're not going to see business travel recover quickly. And if it does, to the extent it does, it's going to be at the very top, meaning the CEOs that have to be there because they're the symbol of the person at the top, the symbol of the corporation. By contrast, very quickly, I mean, I've been in the classroom for 30 odd years teaching. I'm sure Dr. Butler has too. It'd be interesting to hear his experience. My students, my young people, these are 22, 23-year-olds. They are the most experienced travelers. I had never traveled even approximately close to what they've traveled when I was their age. And I expect those young people to return in droves very quickly. And of course, they're young, they're healthy, they don't see the risk like an older person. And so I think tourism travel, if I can call it that, or non-business travel will return much more quickly and much more strongly than will business travel.
And Dr. Lee, so, well, these airline companies, they've been suffering immensely. And do you think they're going to be raising their prices perhaps in the near future once travel does start becoming more available again?
It's, this is being debated right now, and it's partly a function of how much governments can provide, how much support they provide. In Canada, the government's been not very aggressive in providing support to Air Canada, but then you look at Lufthansa in Germany, where they've been given billions and billions of euros, and other airlines have been bailed out by their respective governments. So that's going to go a long way. And then the second quick point to your question, I think the airlines are going to readjust everything. I'm talking their fleet. If their demand is down 50%, they're going to sell off planes, write them off. They're already laying people off. So they're going to reduce their overhead and their cost structure to reflect the reduced demand. But at the end of the day, they're facing higher costs. So especially if that famous middle row, the middle seat. And so I do expect prices to go up if demand does not come back strongly enough to achieve the economies of scale that air mass travel has been based on.
Well, finally, before we go, Dr. Butler, how do you forecast the recovery in the tourism industry, travel overseas, I mean, by tourists? Do you think it will pick up, and do you think there'll be a huge rush once the pandemic subsides?
Essentially, yes. I agree with all of Dr. Lee's comments. I think there is a pent-up demand to travel. I think a lot of people will disregard the risk or minimize the risk, particularly as he said, the younger generation. My grandchildren have traveled internationally more than I had at the age of 30. Right. They've already crossed the Atlantic several times to visit me when I was living in Britain. They're not going to want to stop traveling. And I think the rush will come back, as it is doing in Europe already, very quickly. I think airlines will do everything they can to get customers back. They're hemorrhaging money. They may have deep pockets and made good profits the last couple of years, but they're hurting very much now. And I think all of them will push as madly as they can to get customers back to wherever they can fly to, wherever they're allowed to carry passengers to. So I think there will be a travel rush to come back. I think it'll be mixed in terms of its success, but I think we're already seeing the beginnings of that rush, certainly starting in Europe.
Well, we'll have to wrap up the discussion here. That was Dr. Richard Butler, Emeritus Professor of Tourism at Strathclyde University, and Dr. Ian Lee, Associate Professor at Carleton University, Sprott School of Business. Thank you both so much for joining us.
My great pleasure.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time on Monday in Korea. Have a wonderful weekend wherever you are. Goodbye.